The morning of Samuel Harper's funeral arrived gray and heavy, matching the weight in my chest. At 38, I had buried other relatives, but losing my grandfather felt different, like losing the compass that had guided my dreams for 2 decades. The small suburban cemetery where Samuel would rest overlooked the rolling hills he once told me would make perfect sites for sustainable housing communities. Standing beside the polished mahogany casket, I couldn't shake the memory of our last conversation. Just 3 weeks earlier, Samuel had gripped my hand with surprising strength for an 84-year-old man and whispered, "Danny, that eco-housing project of yours, it's going to change everything. I've made sure of it." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emily squeezed my arm as the minister began his final words, but I noticed her attention drifting toward her mother, Margaret Caldwell, who stood across from us, wearing designer black and an expression of calculated sympathy. Margaret's presence at family events always felt like a performance, each gesture rehearsed for maximum effect. After the service, we gathered at Samuel's house, the modest two-story colonial where I'd spent countless afternoons learning about architecture, sustainability, and the kind of integrity that couldn't be bought. The living room filled with neighbors, old business associates, and family members, sharing stories over casseroles and coffee. "Such a shame about timing," Margaret said, approaching me with her practiced smile. "Harold Bennett called this morning. The will reading is scheduled for Thursday, just 3 days from now. Rather rushed, don't you think?" Something in her tone made me pause. Rushed? How? Well, typically these things take weeks to arrange properly, but Harold insists Samuel left specific instructions about timing. Margaret's laugh was light, almost musical. "You know how your grandfather was about schedules." Harold Bennett himself appeared at my elbow, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive suit that whispered rather than shouted wealth. "Daniel, my condolences. Samuel spoke of you constantly. That eco-housing vision of yours really captured his imagination." Thursday, afternoon, 2 o'clock. Very family, very intimate. Samuel was quite specific about keeping it small. Harold's smile seemed strained. He left very detailed instructions about everything. Thursday arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep through the walls of Harold Bennett's law office. The building was old money elegant, dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and the kind of subdued lighting that made every conversation feel confidential. I arrived early, hoping to speak with Harold privately about Samuel's plans for the inheritance, but found Margaret and Victor already seated at the polished conference table, looking remarkably composed for people attending a will reading. Victor Caldwell, Emily's younger brother, had always struck me as someone perpetually on the verge of his next big break. At 35, he wore his ambition like an expensive cologne, obvious and slightly overwhelming. Today, he seemed unusually confident, drumming his manicured fingers on the table and checking his phone with the frequency of someone expecting good news. Harold entered precisely at 2, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that somehow managed to be both somber and efficient. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is difficult, but Samuel was quite specific about timing and procedure." He opened the portfolio with practiced ceremony, the last will and testament of Samuel Harper, dated, Harold paused, consulting the document, March 15th of this year. My heart jumped. March was only 4 months ago. Samuel had updated his will recently. That explained his confidence about my project, his cryptic comments about making sure of it.
Samuel Harper, being of sound mind and body, hereby bequeaths his estate, including all financial assets, properties, and investments totaling approximately $2 million, to his family, with Margaret Caldwell designated as executor of said estate, to be managed for the benefit of all family members as she deems appropriate. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at Harold, certain I had misheard. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "The estate passes to the family unit with Margaret as executor," Harold said, not meeting my eyes. "What does that mean exactly?" My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. Margaret leaned forward, her expression the picture of maternal concern. "It means Samuel wanted to ensure the money benefits everyone, Daniel. As executor, I'll make sure it's used wisely for family needs, for securing everyone's future." "But Samuel specifically talked about my eco-housing project. He said he'd made provisions." "I'm sure he mentioned many things," Victor interrupted, his smugness barely contained. "But the will is quite clear. Family assets, family management." That evening, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Harold's words, Margaret's confidence, Victor's barely concealed triumph. Something was wrong. Not just disappointing, but fundamentally wrong. Samuel had been too specific, too excited about enabling my eco-housing project to have changed his mind without explanation. At dawn, I called Emily. "I need to go through Samuel's papers. There might be earlier versions of the will or notes that explain." "Daniel, please, can't you just accept?" "No, I can't, Emily. Your grandfather talked about this project constantly. He showed me articles, sketches, even locations he thought would work. He wouldn't have changed his mind without telling me." Samuel's house felt different in the morning light. Smaller, somehow, as if his absence had physically diminished the space. His home office looked exactly as we'd left it after the funeral, but now I approached it like an archaeologist examining a dig site. I started with the obvious places: desk drawers, filing cabinets, the accordion folder where Samuel kept important documents. Most were routine: tax returns, insurance policies, maintenance records for his rental properties. But in the bottom drawer of his desk, behind a stack of architectural magazines, I found a thin manila folder labeled Legal Updates. Inside were drafts of wills dating back 3 years. The earliest version left everything to my beloved grandson, Daniel Harper, to pursue his vision of sustainable community development. Subsequent drafts refined the language, added specific provisions for my education and project funding, even included preliminary architectural plans. But there was no copy of the will Harold had read, no mention of Margaret as executor, no vague language about family management. I was photographing the documents with my phone when I heard Emily's voice from the kitchen. "Daniel, are you here?" Margaret appeared behind Emily, surveying the scattered papers with obvious displeasure. "Finding anything interesting?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "Just getting a sense of Samuel's recent thinking," I replied carefully. "I'm sure you are." She stepped into the room, her gaze cataloging every open drawer, every displaced document. "Of course, you understand that as executor, I'm responsible for securing all estate assets, including papers and personal effects. These are just family memories. Everything in this house is part of the estate now, Daniel. I'm sure you understand." She moved closer, and I caught the scent of her expensive perfume mixed with something else, the metallic smell of determination. "I think it would be best if you limited your visits here until the probate process is complete." Later that evening, alone in my apartment, I examined a letter I'd spotted earlier, partially hidden beneath Samuel's desk blotter. The letterhead was from a law office I didn't recognize, and the visible text mentioned additional provisions and Delaney. It was dated 6 months ago, addressed Samuel from Ruth Delaney, attorney at law. The full text made my heart pound. "Dear Samuel, as discussed, I prepared the additional documentation according to your specifications. The sealed provisions will remain in my custody until such time as they're needed. Your instinct about potential challenges to your wishes may prove prophetic. Rest assured, your grandson's future is protected. Regards, Ruth Delaney." At the bottom, in Samuel's handwriting, was a note: "Emergency contacts. Ruth knows the truth. Ruth Delaney's law office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house on the east side of town, far from the marble columns and mahogany paneling of Harold Bennett's establishment. Ruth herself was nothing like I had expected. Perhaps 70 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Sit down, Mr. Harper," she said, gesturing to a worn leather chair across from her desk. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man, principled, forward-thinking, and, unfortunately, very good at reading people's true intentions." She opened her desk drawer and withdrew a sealed manila envelope, thick and official-looking. Samuel's handwriting across the front read, "To be opened only if Daniel contests the will. R. Delaney, executor." "He came to see me 6 months ago," Ruth continued. "Said he was concerned about vultures circling, waiting for him to die. His words, not mine. He was quite specific about your wife's family, particularly her mother. Said Margaret Caldwell had been making increasingly pointed comments about family responsibilities and proper stewardship of his assets." Ruth broke the seal on the envelope and withdrew a document. "This is a codicil to Samuel Harper's will, legally witnessed and notarized. It supersedes any previous will and specifically names you as sole heir to his estate." My hands shook as I read the document. It was comprehensive, detailed, and absolutely clear. "I, Samuel Harper, being of sound mind and body, hereby bequeath my entire estate to my grandson, Daniel Harper, to be used in pursuit of sustainable housing development and community planning, as we have discussed extensively." "The date is March 20th, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. 5 days after the will Harold read to you. This is Samuel's true final will." Ruth leaned back in her chair. "He brought it to me personally, along with very specific instructions about when and how to reveal it. Why not give it to Harold directly? Because Samuel suspected Harold might be pressured to suppress it. By entrusting it to an independent attorney with no ties to the Caldwell family, he ensured it would survive any manipulation." Ruth smiled grimly. "Your grandfather was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers." The next few days passed in a strange state of suspended tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. I went through the motions of normal life, work, meals, conversations with Emily, while secretly preparing for battle. Ruth and I met twice more, refining our strategy and reviewing the evidence Samuel had accumulated against Margaret. The pressure campaign began subtly on Saturday morning, when Emily informed me that her mother had generously offered to help us find a larger apartment. "She thinks we should start looking in neighborhoods that match our new financial situation," Emily said over breakfast, not quite meeting my eyes. "Well, with the family money, we could afford something much nicer. Mother found a lovely 3-bedroom in Riverside Heights. We could have a space for an office. Maybe start thinking about children." The manipulation was elegant, offering everything I had wanted while making it contingent on accepting Margaret's version of events. "Emily, that money isn't Margaret's to spend. Daniel, please, she's trying to help. She's trying to buy my silence." Sunday brought a visit from Victor, who arrived at our apartment with the swagger of someone who had already won. He was driving a new BMW, sleek black and obviously expensive. "Just a small advance on future earnings," he replied with a grin that made my skin crawl. "Mother thought I should upgrade my image for the new business ventures."
Real estate development. Actually, funny how things work out. Victor's eyes gleamed with malicious amusement. "We're looking at some prime locations for luxury housing projects. Market rate stuff, you understand. Much more profitable than those eco-friendly pipe dreams." That evening, alone in my apartment while Emily visited her mother, I called Ruth with updates on the pressure campaign. "They're moving faster than I expected," Ruth said. "Margaret must be more worried about your investigation than she's letting on." "Harold Bennett called me this afternoon," Ruth continued, "to offer me a substantial sum to reconsider my involvement in this matter." His words. "The fact that he made the offer means Margaret is starting to panic. She knows we have something, even if she's not sure what."
Emily returned home that night with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of resignation and pleading that made my heart ache. "Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you planning to challenge Mother's authority as executor?" The question hung in the air between us like a blade. "Emily, what if I told you that your grandfather left specific provisions ensuring I could pursue the eco-housing project, that the will Harold read wasn't his final will?" Her face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "What if I told you that your mother has been planning this for months, that she pressured Harold into suppressing the real will?" "I would say you sound like someone who's creating conspiracy theories to avoid accepting disappointment." The words hit me like a physical blow. Margaret had done her work well, conditioning Emily to dismiss any challenge to the official narrative as delusion. And if I had proof? Emily's silence stretched long enough to break my heart. Finally, quietly, she said, "I would ask you to consider what's more important, some project or keeping this family together." "Daniel," Emily's voice carried a warning I had never heard before. "Mother says if you challenge the will, it could tear the family apart permanently. She says she might have to choose between protecting the family's interests and maintaining relationships with people who attack her integrity." "Emily," I said quietly, "on Tuesday, everything is going to change. I need you to know that, whatever happens, whatever your mother has told you, I love you. And your grandfather loved both of us enough to make sure the truth would eventually come out." She looked at me with eyes full of sorrow and something that might have been fear. "Promise me you won't do anything that will destroy this family." "I promise I'll do what your grandfather would have wanted." It wasn't the promise she was asking for, and we both knew it. Tuesday was coming, and with it, the moment when truth and lies would finally meet in open battle. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes everything feel electric with possibility or danger. Ruth called at 7 a.m., her voice sharp and focused. "Today is the day, Daniel. Are you ready?" "As ready as I can be," I replied, watching Emily move through our kitchen like a ghost, avoiding my eyes. She hadn't spoken to me since our conversation Sunday night, and the silence between us felt like a living thing feeding on our mutual dread. The family investment meeting was scheduled at 2 o'clock at Margaret's house, a sprawling colonial in the most expensive part of town. Emily had mentioned that Margaret planned to unveil her comprehensive strategy for managing Samuel's legacy, including preliminary investments in family allocations, the perfect stage for our revelation. Ruth and I met at 11 to finalize our approach. She had prepared multiple copies of the codicil, along with supporting documentation that would be impossible for Margaret to dismiss or explain away. "Your grandfather was thorough, Daniel. He anticipated every possible objection Margaret might raise. What if she claims the codicil is fake?"
Ruth smiled grimly. That's where Samuel's foresight really shines. He had the document notarized by 3 different witnesses, including a retired judge who knew him personally. Margaret can challenge a lot of things, but she can't challenge Judge Morrison's integrity. We drove separately to Margaret's house, Ruth arriving precisely at 2, while I waited in my car until 2:15, giving Margaret time to begin her presentation before making my entrance. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and I could see through the dining room windows that the meeting had indeed started. Margaret stood at the head of a polished mahogany table, addressing a room full of family members and what appeared to be financial advisors. She wore a burgundy suit that projected authority and wealth, her hands gesturing confidently as she outlined her vision for the inheritance. Victor sat to her right, looking smug and victorious, while Emily occupied a chair near the window, her face pale and drawn. I took a deep breath, opened the car door, and walked toward the house that would either restore my grandfather's legacy or destroy my marriage forever. The front door was unlocked. a calculated display of Margaret's confidence that nothing could threaten her control. I stepped into the foyer and could hear her voice carrying from the dining room. As I mentioned, the initial real estate investments will focus on high-yield properties in developing markets, with Victor overseeing the construction partnerships. I entered the dining room without knocking. Margaret stopped mid-sentence, her face cycling through surprise, irritation, and barely controlled rage in the space of a heartbeat. "Daniel," she said, her voice honey-sweet with an undertone of steel, "how lovely that you could join us." "Sorry I'm late," I replied, surveying the room. Margaret had assembled an impressive audience, extended family members, financial advisors, and what appeared to be a real estate developer, all arranged to witness her triumphant assumption of control. Margaret recovered quickly, returning to her presentation. "As I mentioned, the estate provides us with unprecedented opportunities for growth and development. With proper management, we can ensure that Samuel's legacy benefits the entire family for generations." I waited until she paused for effect, then spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Actually, Margaret, I think there might be some confusion about Samuel's legacy." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret's smile became razor-thin. "Confusion, Daniel?" "Yes, about who actually controls his estate." I turned to address the room while pulling out my phone. "You see, Samuel left very specific instructions about his final wishes." Margaret stepped forward, her composure cracking slightly. "Daniel, this isn't the time or place for your disappointment about—" "Actually, it is exactly the time and place, especially since you seem to be making investment decisions with money that isn't yours." Gasps rippled through the room. Emily half rose from her chair, her face stricken. "Daniel, please don't." Margaret regained her footing with impressive speed. "Everyone, please disregard Daniel's outburst. He's been struggling with grief and has developed some unfortunate delusions about Samuel's intentions." That's when Ruth Delaney stepped through the dining room doorway, her presence commanding immediate attention, despite her modest appearance. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ruth Delaney, attorney at law, and I believe Mr. Harper is about to share some very important information about Samuel Harper's true, final will." Margaret went white. Harold Bennett, who had been sitting quietly near the back of the room, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. "Ruth! That's not—" Ruth began, but Ruth was already withdrawing the codicil from her briefcase.
"This document," Ruth announced, "is a legally binding codicil to Samuel Harper's will, dated March 20th, superseding any previous documents and specifically naming Daniel Harper as sole heir to the entire estate." The room erupted. Harold Bennett stood abruptly, knocking over his water glass. Victor started to object, but Ruth continued speaking over the chaos. The codicil was prepared under Samuel Harper's direct supervision, witnessed by 3 independent parties, including retired Judge Morrison, and notarized according to state law requirements. Margaret found her voice. "That's impossible. Harold assured me that he would—" "Harold assured you of what, Margaret?" Ruth turned to face the room, her voice cutting through the noise. "That he would suppress this document? That he would present an earlier version of the will to serve your purposes?" Harold's face had gone ashen. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Ruth produced a folder, thick with documents. "Then perhaps you can explain these email communications between you and Margaret Caldwell, dating back 6 months, discussing ways to delay the proper execution of Samuel's estate." Emily was staring at her mother with an expression of dawning horror. "Mother, what is she talking about?" Margaret rallied with the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. "This is obviously a coordinated attack on our family. Daniel has clearly paid this woman to fabricate documents." Ruth's laugh was cold and professional. "Mrs. Caldwell, I've been practicing estate law for 40 years. My reputation is impeccable, and unlike some people in this room, I don't accept bribes to suppress legal documents." That's when Harold Bennett broke. He stood slowly, his hands shaking. "Margaret, I can't do this anymore. I told you from the beginning that suppressing the codicil was illegal." The silence that followed was deafening. The aftermath of Harold's confession transformed Margaret's dining room into something resembling a courtroom. Ruth took charge with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months, while Margaret frantically called her own attorney. Within an hour, both sides had legal representation present, and the dining room had been cleared of everyone except the principals. Margaret's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Wells, immediately challenged the validity of the codicil, demanding forensic analysis of the signatures and questioning Ruth's authority to present the document. "Your client knew this day would come," Ruth told Patricia Wells. "Samuel Harper anticipated Margaret's scheme and prepared accordingly. Every signature has been verified, every witness interviewed, every procedural requirement satisfied beyond any reasonable doubt." Patricia Wells studied the documents with growing alarm, while Margaret sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "What about the substantial investments already initiated based on the original will?" she demanded. "My client has entered into legally binding contracts." "Using stolen funds," Ruth replied smoothly. "Funds obtained through fraudulent suppression of testamentary documents. Margaret Caldwell has no legal authority to spend one penny of Samuel Harper's estate." Victor, who had been silent through most of the proceedings, suddenly exploded. "This is ridiculous. We're family. Daniel is just being greedy." Actually, Daniel hadn't said a word since Ruth's arrival. He sat quietly, watching his wife's family implode under the weight of their own deception. Emily remained frozen beside him, her world reshaping itself with each revelation. Harold Bennett provided the final blow when Patricia Wells pressed him about his role in suppressing the codicil. "Margaret threatened to destroy my practice," he said quietly. "She had documentation of some questionable billing practices from years ago and significant influence with the State Bar Association. I felt I had no choice."
The legal conclusion was swift and decisive. Patricia Wells advised Margaret to cease all financial activities related to the estate pending formal probate proceedings. Ruth's documentation was so comprehensive that challenging the codicil would be both expensive and futile. Margaret Caldwell's 30-year reputation for social manipulation crumbled in a single afternoon. The formal court hearing 3 weeks later was almost anticlimactic. Judge Morrison himself presided over the proceedings, lending additional weight to the codicil's validity. Margaret attended with a different lawyer, Patricia Wells having withdrawn from the case, but offered no meaningful challenge to the evidence. Judge Morrison ruled definitively. The codicil presented by Attorney Delaney supersedes all previous testamentary documents and clearly establishes Daniel Harper as sole heir to the estate of Samuel Harper. Furthermore, the evidence suggests willful suppression of this document by parties acting in bad faith. Harold Bennett faced disciplinary action from the State Bar Association and quietly retired. Margaret's social standing in the community evaporated as word spread about her attempted theft. Victor discovered that his new BMW would need to be returned, as it had been purchased with funds he had no legal right to access. But the personal fallout proved more devastating than the legal consequences. Emily struggled to reconcile the mother she thought she knew with the manipulative woman exposed in court. She moved back to our apartment, but the easy intimacy we had once shared felt fractured, perhaps permanently. I tried to comfort her, but she remained distant, withdrawn. "I feel like everything I believed about my family was a lie," she said one evening, as we sat in our living room surrounded by boxes of Samuel's papers that had finally been returned to me. Margaret had isolated herself, refusing to speak to anyone in the family. Victor split his time between lawyer meetings and job interviews, his development dreams having evaporated along with his access to stolen funds. Ruth Delaney became something of a local legend among estate attorneys, her methodical destruction of Margaret's scheme earning her recognition as a formidable advocate for testamentary integrity. She refused all interviews about the case, maintaining that Samuel Harper deserved the credit for his extraordinary foresight. The money itself felt strange when it finally transferred to my accounts. $2 million that represented not just financial freedom, but vindication of my grandfather's faith in my dreams. Yet every dollar carried the weight of family relationships destroyed and trust that might never be rebuilt. Emily and I began couples counseling, trying to navigate the wreckage of her family's betrayal and my necessary but devastating response. Our therapist helped us understand that Margaret's manipulation had affected Emily as much as anyone, creating patterns of guilt and obligation that would take time to overcome. Slowly, carefully, we began rebuilding our marriage on a foundation of honesty rather than harmony. 6 months later, I stood in a muddy field on the outskirts of town, watching surveyors mark the boundaries of what would become Samuel Harper's sustainable housing community. The autumn air carried the smell of turned earth and possibility, reminding me of all the afternoons my grandfather and I had spent walking this same land, dreaming of what it could become. Emily stood beside me, her hand finally comfortable in mine again. The healing process had been slow and sometimes painful, but we had chosen each other over the easier path of pretending the betrayal hadn't happened. Our marriage felt different now, more intentional, more honest. Ruth Delaney arrived for the groundbreaking ceremony, driving her practical sedan and wearing the same comfortable shoes she had worn to our first meeting. She carried a small gift wrapped in plain brown paper.
"Your grandfather wanted you to have this when the project began," she said, handing me the package. Inside was Samuel's old drafting compass, the instrument he had used to design his first buildings decades earlier, along with a note in his careful handwriting. "Danny, the compass points true north, but only if you trust it to guide you through all weather. Your project will face storms, but if you build with integrity, the foundation will hold. I am proud of the man you have become, proud of the dreams you carry forward. Build something beautiful, something lasting, something that proves good can triumph over greed. With love and faith in the future, Samuel." Margaret Caldwell had moved to another state, her reputation too damaged to remain in a community that knew her story. Victor eventually found work with a construction company in a different city, rebuilding his life from the ground up. Harold Bennett's retirement had been quiet and permanent. The sustainable housing community would take 3 years to complete, featuring energy-efficient homes, affordable to young families, and designed with environmental stewardship as the central principle. Every house would include a small plaque reading, "Samuel Harper, Community Dreamer, Builder, Believer in Tomorrow." As the sun set over the construction site, Emily and I walked back to our car, past the sign that would soon welcome new residents to a neighborhood built on the foundation of one man's vision and another man's refusal to let that vision be stolen. The inheritance had been about more than money. It had been about preserving the possibility that truth could defeat deception, that patience could overcome manipulation, that love, carefully tended, could survive even the most devastating betrayals. Samuel Harper's legacy lived on, not in dollars and bank accounts, but in the homes we were building, the families we would shelter, and the proof that sometimes, if you fight hard enough for what matters, the good guys actually win. Ruth Delaney kept her promise and wrote a memoir about the case titled, "When the Truth Matters More Than Family Harmony." It became required reading in several law schools and helped change state regulations about estate document handling. Our marriage survived stronger for having been tested. Emily never spoke to her mother again, but found peace in building new relationships based on honesty rather than obligation. We had learned that some betrayals create space for better things to grow. The compass Samuel left me sits on my desk now, pointing true north, toward a future built on the foundation of his wisdom, his foresight, and his unshakable belief that good can triumph over greed if good people refuse to give up. The community that bears his name will stand long after we are gone, a testament to the power of dreams protected by love and the courage to fight for what is right, even when the cost seems too high to bear. Some inheritances are measured in money, but the greatest legacies are measured in the dreams they make possible and the truth they preserve for future generations. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.